On July 29, 2026, a man walked out of a Kentucky prison with no parole officer waiting for him, no mandatory supervision controlling where he could live, and no remaining prison sentence hanging over his head. His name was Ronald Exantus. Nearly 11 years earlier, Exantus had entered a stranger's home in the middle of the night and stabbed 6-year-old Logan Tipton to death while the child was sleeping. Logan's father and 2 sisters were also attacked. They survived, but the Tipton family would never again live the life they had known before that night. Exantus did not deny that he killed Logan. Prosecutors and defense attorneys agreed about who carried out the attack. Yet when the trial ended, the jury found him not guilty of murder by reason of insanity. At the same time, the same jury found him guilty but mentally ill for attacking Logan's surviving family members. That distinction eventually became the difference between a possible lifetime of confinement and a sentence that could legally expire. To Logan's family, it felt impossible to understand. How could one man be considered legally insane when he killed a child, but still criminally responsible when he attacked 3 other people during the same violent episode? How could a defendant once facing the death penalty eventually leave prison after serving less than 12 years from the date of the crime? And why did Kentucky pass a new law inspired by Logan's death, only for that law to arrive too late to keep his killer confined? The answers reveal a case that was never only about one terrible night. It became a story about mental illness, criminal responsibility, sentencing credits, constitutional limits, and the painful difference between what the law permits and what a victim's family believes justice requires. The attack happened during the early morning hours of December 7, 2015, in Versailles, Kentucky. The Tipton family did not know Ronald Exantus. Investigators found no personal dispute, revenge motive, or previous connection between him and the people inside the house. Exantus had driven from Indianapolis into Kentucky. He entered the Tipton home and obtained a knife from inside the residence. 6-year-old Logan Tipton was asleep. The attack came without warning. Exantus stabbed Logan repeatedly. When other family members responded to the disturbance, the violence continued. Logan's father, Dean Tipton, and 2 of Logan's sisters were injured. Dean eventually managed to restrain the intruder until police arrived, but Logan could not be saved. The death of a sleeping child inside his own home immediately horrified the surrounding community. The absence of an obvious connection between Exantus and the Tipton family made the crime even more frightening. This was not a confrontation that escalated. It was not a robbery that suddenly turned violent. According to the evidence presented in court, Exantus had entered a random family's home and carried out an attack that appeared almost impossible to explain through an ordinary criminal motive. That question soon became the center of the case. What was happening inside Ronald Exantus's mind? Exantus had worked as a dialysis nurse. He had been employed in a profession that required responsibility, training, and regular contact with vulnerable patients. But his defense attorneys argued that by December 2015, he was experiencing a severe mental breakdown. They described him as living inside what they called an insane nightmare. They said signs of deterioration had developed before the attack, and that he lacked the mental capacity required to understand the nature or wrongfulness of what he was doing. The prosecution did not dispute that mental health evidence was relevant, but prosecutors challenged the quality and conclusions of the defense's psychiatric evidence. They argued that the defense had not adequately established the legal standard required for an insanity verdict. This distinction is important. A person can suffer from a serious mental illness and still be legally responsible for a crime. The insanity defense does not simply ask whether the defendant had a psychiatric diagnosis. It asks whether the illness affected the person so profoundly that the law cannot treat the act as a product of ordinary criminal intent. The legal question is narrower than the medical question. During the 2018 trial, jurors were given several possible verdicts. They could find Exantus guilty. They could find him guilty but mentally ill. They could acquit him. Or they could find him not guilty by reason of insanity. After hearing the evidence, the jury reached different conclusions for different charges. For the murder of Logan and the burglary of the Tipton home, Exantus was found not guilty by reason of insanity. For the assaults against Logan's surviving family members, he was found guilty but mentally ill. That outcome is the legal heart of the controversy. All of the violence occurred during one connected episode. Yet the verdict treated Exantus's criminal responsibility differently depending on the victim and the charge. The verdict did not mean the jury believed Exantus had not killed Logan. Both sides acknowledged that he had. A verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity means the defendant committed the physical act, but is not held criminally responsible in the same way as a person considered legally sane. Normally, such a verdict may lead to psychiatric commitment rather than punishment in an ordinary prison. But Exantus's case was unusually complicated because the jury also convicted him of serious assault charges. He therefore entered the correctional system under a prison sentence based on the surviving victims, not a murder sentence based on Logan's death. In April 2018, Exantus received a total sentence of 20 years for the assaults. For many members of the public, the sentence sounded like 20 years of actual incarceration. But a sentence announced in court and the time a prisoner ultimately serves are not always identical. Kentucky law allowed eligible inmates to receive various forms of sentence credit. Credits could be earned through good behavior, educational achievements, treatment programs, and other approved activities. These credits did not erase the conviction. They changed the date on which the sentence was legally considered complete. Officials later said Exantus accumulated nearly 9 years of credit. His original maximum serve-out date was reportedly November 24, 2035. The credits moved that date forward dramatically. This is one reason descriptions of his release can become confusing. Some reports called it an early release. Kentucky correctional officials stressed that he was not released early in the sense of receiving a special act of mercy or a new parole decision. The department calculated his sentence under the laws that applied to him. Once the adjusted expiration date arrived, officials said they no longer had legal authority to keep him in prison. Both descriptions reflect part of the truth. He left confinement years before the original maximum date printed on his sentence calculation, but the state considered those years legally satisfied through credits authorized by Kentucky law. The first major release occurred on October 1, 2025. Exantus was placed on mandatory re-entry supervision, a system designed to monitor certain prisoners during the final portion of their sentences as they transition back into the community. He moved to Florida. Within days, the situation changed. Florida authorities accused him of failing to register as a convicted felon, as required under state law. Reports also raised alarm because he was staying near an elementary school. He was arrested in Florida and returned to Kentucky. Kentucky's parole authorities later revoked his mandatory re-entry supervision. The decision placed him back in prison to serve the remaining calculated portion of his sentence. For the Tipton family, that return offered only temporary relief. The final expiration date was still approaching. Kentucky Attorney General Russell Coleman and local prosecutors explored available legal options. State officials warned that unless a separate lawful basis existed to confine Exantus, the Department of Corrections could not hold him after his sentence expired. One possible route involved involuntary psychiatric hospitalization. Civil commitment is different from criminal punishment. A state generally cannot confine someone indefinitely simply because the public fears what that person might do. Authorities must meet specific legal standards showing that the individual currently qualifies for involuntary treatment, often because of mental illness combined with a present danger to himself or others. The horror of a past crime can be powerful evidence in public debate, but civil commitment usually depends on a person's current mental condition, not only on the emotional force of what happened years earlier. Officials notified the trial judge, the prosecutor, and the defense that civil commitment procedures could be considered if the legal requirements were met. No new order emerged that authorized continued confinement. On July 29, 2026, Exantus' sentence expired as calculated under Kentucky law. He was released without the mandatory supervision that had existed during his brief release in 2025. The Kentucky Department of Corrections emphasized that the parole board had not chosen to free him. He had not received clemency. He had reached the end of the sentence the department was legally permitted to administer. That explanation did little to ease the Tipton family's anger. Dean Tipton said the court system had effectively given his family a life sentence while allowing the man responsible for Logan's death to regain his freedom. For Dean, the legal categories could not change the central reality. His 6-year-old son was dead. The person who killed him was alive and free. The remaining members of the family continued to live with physical scars, traumatic memories, and the knowledge that an attack inside their home had permanently changed every part of their lives. The controversy eventually reached the Kentucky legislature. Lawmakers introduced House Bill 422, widely known as Logan's Law. The legislation was not a single narrow change. It addressed several weaknesses that lawmakers believed had become visible through the Exantus case and other violent crimes. One of its most important provisions concerned inconsistent insanity verdicts. Under the new law, a jury may not find a defendant not guilty by reason of insanity for one charge while finding that same defendant guilty or guilty, but mentally ill, on another charge arising from the same course of conduct. This provision speaks directly to what happened in Exantus's trial. The law attempts to prevent a future jury from deciding that a defendant lacked criminal responsibility for one part of a connected episode, but possessed enough responsibility to be convicted for another part of the same episode. Logan's Law also changes procedures at the end of a sentence for certain defendants found guilty but mentally ill. It creates stronger mechanisms for prosecutors or treatment professionals to seek involuntary hospitalization, court-ordered treatment, or other legally authorized intervention when a mentally ill offender is approaching release. The legislation also restricts access to mandatory reentry supervision for some offenders with serious records or supervision violations. The goal is not to declare that every mentally ill defendant must remain confined forever. The goal is to ensure that courts do not reach contradictory outcomes and that dangerousness and treatment needs receive formal review before an offender simply reaches the prison gate. The Kentucky legislature passed the measure by overwhelming margins. Governor Andy Beshear signed it on April 2, 2026, but the law could not be used to change Exantus's verdict or add years to his sentence. The reason comes from one of the most fundamental protections in American constitutional law. Governments cannot pass a new criminal law and then use it to increase the punishment for conduct that occurred before the law existed. This prohibition against ex post facto punishment prevents lawmakers from changing the consequences of a crime after the defendant has already committed it. The principle protects everyone from retroactive government power. But in cases like Logan's, the same principle can produce an outcome that feels unbearable to victims. Lawmakers could learn from the case. They could rewrite procedures for future defendants. They could restrict future release programs. They could not return to 2015, change the rules, and impose a harsher result on Ronald Exantus. That is why Logan's Law carries such a painful contradiction. The law exists because of what happened to Logan, yet it could not keep Logan's killer confined. The case also raises a more difficult question about the insanity defense itself. The insanity defense exists because the justice system recognizes that punishment assumes a meaningful degree of choice and understanding. A person who is completely unable to understand the nature of an act may not possess the same moral and legal responsibility as a person who plans a crime for profit, revenge, or personal gain. Removing the insanity defense entirely could allow severely psychotic defendants to be punished as though their minds were functioning normally. But an insanity verdict is not supposed to mean that a dangerous person simply walks away. Ideally, the system transfers the individual from criminal punishment into secure psychiatric treatment for as long as the legal standards for confinement are met. The Exantus case exposed what can happen when verdicts, prison sentences, and mental health procedures do not fit together cleanly. He was considered insane in relation to the two charges that would likely have carried the most severe punishment. He was considered criminally responsible, though mentally ill, for the charges that produced his prison sentence. Once that sentence expired, the state needed a new and independent legal basis to hold him. Without one, correctional officials were required to release him. This does not necessarily mean that one judge or one official secretly decided to be lenient. The result was produced by several different parts of the system. The jury decided criminal responsibility. The judge imposed a sentence based on the convictions. The legislature had created the rules governing sentence credits. The Department of Corrections calculated those credits. The parole board revoked supervision when Exantus violated its conditions. Mental health law determined whether involuntary treatment remained available. The Constitution prevented a new law from retroactively increasing punishment. Each institution acted within a limited area of authority. But when those decisions were combined, the final result was one that almost no member of Logan's family could recognize as justice. That is perhaps the deepest lesson of the case. A legal system can follow its own procedures and still produce an outcome that destroys public confidence. The law often speaks in categories such as murder, assault, insanity, mental illness, sentence credit, supervision, and civil commitment. A grieving family speaks in a different language. They remember a 6-year-old boy in a football uniform. They remember the night their home became a crime scene. They remember hospital rooms, funerals, and the years spent attending hearings and fighting for reforms. They do not experience Logan's death as one charge among several charges. They experience it as the permanent absence of a child. Logan's law may prevent another family from facing exactly the same legal contradiction. It may force courts to treat a defendant's mental responsibility consistently across crimes committed during one connected event. It may also create more opportunities for review before certain mentally ill offenders leave custody. But no law can repair what happened on December 7, 2015. No legislative vote can return Logan to his parents. And no explanation of sentence calculations can make 11 years feel equal to the lifetime the Tipton family lost. Ronald Exantus is now free because the sentence authorized under his convictions has ended. Logan Tipton's family continues to fight because, in their view, the consequences of the crime will never end. Their campaign has already changed Kentucky law. The question now is whether Logan's law will truly prevent another case like this, or whether more gaps will become visible only after another family is forced to pay the price.